So I grew up in the state of Illinois, and I was
Okay.
born in Champaign-Urbana. My
Oh, no
father,
kidding.
yeah,
Okay.
and that's where I ended up going to university as well.
Oh.
So my father was a professor with a very famous name. So his name was Karl Marx with a K, and he taught economics. So when I was born, he was getting his PhD in economics. And then we moved across the state, almost all the way to the Mississippi River, and to a small college town called Macomb, Illinois, which was the home of Western Illinois University. And and so I grew up in a very small town of 14,000 people in the middle of
Wow.
nowhere. What the region used to joke around was that we were called Forgotonia because all of the state taxes would go to feed Chicago's needs, and nothing would trickle back down to the farmers in Forgotonia. So it was an interesting childhood because you had both the university setting, which was very, outside of a small rural town, but then you had this sort of like small town Midwestern values thing,
Hmm.
which the positive aspects of that were hard work and earnestness and self-reliance and honesty and all these kinds of things. And so I kind of had both the best of both worlds is the way I look at it.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, Champaign, Urbana, Illinois, and certainly the other town are there small places.
Yeah.
Was there anything about your particular home that you have fond memories of?
Oh, well, there's a bunch. I mean, it goes to you know, people and friends but from an architectural standpoint, and I think Frank Lloyd Wright talked about this, there's a certain aspect of being on the prairie. You know, Illinois is a prairie state. It's very
Mhm.
flat in general,
Very flat.
and
Yeah.
and it's minimalist in many ways. And there's very little to do there. So what you end up doing is you're sort of motivated to use your imagination, or some people are. So you develop this dream, this romantic notion of the outside world, uh, and
Hmm.
also inventing ways to keep yourself amused. And in my case, I decided I wanted to be an architect when I was 7 years old, and just imagining a world outside of this small little world that I lived in.
I like that. I like that description. So, how was it at 7 years old you thought that you wanted to be an architect, or you decided at
Oh,
that
so
point?
so I wanted to be an artist,
Okay.
and one could argue that in the end, that's kind of what I've ended up becoming, um, and sort of artist slash poet slash architect.
Hmm.
And but that means, could mean many different things. But I wanted to be an artist first. I wanted to be a painter first. And but in the Midwest, that's not a proper
Job.
vocation. And
Right.
yeah, and that didn't come from my parents. It wasn't like my parents said, "You've got to become, a professional. You've got to do this. You've got to do that." But the community, the community in general, it's like, well, that's a hobby.
Yeah.
That's not a thing. So so uh, so we were in, you know, I don't know if it was first or second grade. 7 years old is quite young, and but they had a little thing that was like career day for kids, and they had a little book, a little picture book, and it would show, like, the classic things in the Midwest at the time. This would have been in the early '60s. It's like Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy. Do you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, policeman, a fireman?
Hmm.
At the time, instead of a firefighter, um,
Hmm.
it was different times, and that's a whole nother aspect of growing up in an era. But which we can talk about a little bit later, gender in architecture and gender and other things. But anyway, they listed all these things, and it was like, yeah, I don't want to be a lawyer, don't want to be a doctor, and you kept going and you kept going. And it got to engineer, and because engineer was building things, and I kind of looked ahead. There was no artist in this whole book, right? There wouldn't be. It's not a proper career. And so they got to engineer, and that sounded interesting because you build things, but it didn't sound creative enough. And then the next page was architect. And it said architect, blends, an understanding of engineering and construction, but is an artist, is doing things from the imagination, and all of those words started to appeal to me. And it was the only thing in there that had sort of a creative side to it, in the career book. And so I thought, that's it. Then I was 7.
Of all the options here, that's the one.
So the funny thing is, it's been a straight line in many ways, which makes it easier. My daughter, for example, it took her quite a while to end up with her career. Or my mother became a psych nurse at the age of 50. So it took her a long, long time. And then she ended up, but she has a PhD in educational psychology, but she ended up as a psych nurse at the VA treating ex-soldiers for addiction issues, which is not a small thing in the VA. And so which was a perfect career for her. She was very clinical, but empathetic at the same time. So, but she wandered, but I knew when I was 7. She didn't know until she was 50.
She needed that career book.
Well, she would try things. So what she did was she started out in just straight education, and then she went out and she was teaching, 3rd graders, and she felt like it was really just like being a parent in a classroom rather than a teacher, and she didn't really care for it. So then she went into child psychology, which was really interesting. I was, one of her, victims or
test subjects.
So I would like to say I was pre-shrunk as I came out of high school. But it was interesting because in that time period, which would have been in the early 70s when I was in high school, my parents got divorced, and so we lived with my mother, and I didn't have any specific rules when I was growing up. I had a condition, which was very tricky, and wasn't as difficult as it seems for me personally, but would be for all of my friends, which was unconditional honesty. So she could ask about anything, and you couldn't lie to her. And she was very smart, and she was a child psychologist, so she knew if you were lying. So it was an interesting trade-off, right? Sorry.
There are no rules in the sense that you didn't have a curfew and things like this.
I could have girls spend the night, in theory. Not that girls' parents would let them spend the night, but in theory, and my mother, she's passed away, so they're not going to come get her. But she would buy us beer sometimes, and I had this little group of friends, and I had this it was a tri-level house, so I had the lower level, which was like the family room, and it opened up to the backyard. So my friends could come over, they could drink beer, they could smoke, they could do all these things, but mostly what we did was just play guitar. But sometimes they were the musicians, I was the visual artist. And but sometimes, we'd have 20, 30 people over, and this would be, 2 or 3 times a week.
Wow.
And most of the kids, they couldn't do any of that. Like the idea that they could have a party at their house was like, okay, once in your lifetime, senior year graduation, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a delightful thing. Later, though, I'm writing a memoir with Tim Abrahams, who's got a publishing house called Machine Books, and he also writes for the Architectural Record. And so in there, I was kind of describing that later when I started talking to my sisters about that era of my childhood, and one sister's 1 year younger and the other sister's 4 years younger, they said, "Oh yeah, we didn't get that. You got no rules. We got all the rules. Like all the rules you didn't get, we got those."
Yeah.
The pendulum swung the other way.
Pendulum swung. So I had no idea that it was so one-sided. Until after my mother passed away, and I was talking to my sister Debbie.
Yeah.
She was like, "Oh no, you had it so easy." It's like
I feel like the firstborn usually does. I'm the secondborn, and I have a younger sister. And definitely the first one got more than we did.
Yeah. Well, it was. My wife's an only child, and that's another
It's
form of,
different.
Anyway, so yeah, it was a nice childhood, and then I was desperate to move away. So right after college, uh, I moved. Well, in 1981. So I spent 1 year working in my hometown, and that was by accident. So my hometown had one architect. It was the only architect for 100 miles around there.
Wow.
I
A
mean, the
hundred
next
miles.
architect would have
Jeez.
been in Peoria, Illinois, right, which
Yeah. Okay.
is dead center in the United States. They used to joke around, if it plays in Peoria, everyone in the United States will love it. But they were talking about Burl Ives and kind of casual music, kind of a thing, popular music.
You're right.
But Peoria was like the middle of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So anyway. I moved to San Francisco in '81, and then I've been there ever since. Although I would say San Francisco is a great place to live. It's not a great place to be an architect.
We can talk about that, I think, for sure. But so
Yeah.
sticking with the story, so from the age of 7, you see the list of people to become, and there's architect, and you decide that this seems like the right path.
Yeah.
So when you finished high school, you ended up, I think you said, working for a year in your hometown, kind of as a fluke, or so to speak, and then you
well,
left.
so I graduate from high school. I go to college at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And then after
For
college,
architecture?
in architecture, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And I would
Okay.
say that when I decided I wanted to be an architect, I actually didn't really know what it meant. I mean, I knew it was about designing buildings, and I knew this. I mean, but you need to go to architecture school before you really get what it is that you're signing up for. And I think almost universally, there's some great TikTok videos and Instagram moments of people explaining, like especially these days, people that are right out of school explaining what it means to be an architect. It's like addiction to coffee. And we look at doctors and lawyers talking about all the hours they work, and we go, oh, you're amateurs. We perfect the 80, 90-hour week every week and even recently in 2021, I did a design competition. So this would have been 62, and I worked 10 80-hour weeks in a row on the design competition. Yeah. So I mean, that's just architect's life. It was there. The door was infinitely open. It was during COVID, so actually there wasn't that much else to do. I think it would be very difficult to do that now in post-COVID. But anyway, the thing is, architecture is a culture as well as a profession. And it's interesting to see, the positives and the negatives of that. And I've, in the recent years, been doing a lot of advocacy for change in the profession, hence the WAF 10 Provocations. But then I did a book with the Architectural Review called The Absurdity of Beauty, and that was in 2018. And then in 2023, Towards Abundance, the subtitle being, The Delightful Paradoxes of Gender. So they relate to each other. The books, it's the same critical analysis of the profession and whether the profession is becoming more relevant or less relevant to society in general. And
so, on that, so in what ways is the profession becoming more and less relevant? Is it, talk us through some of the ideas with that.
Well, I think in the old days, so the old days would have been early modernism.
Okay.
Architects designed from the heart. They did. And I think that we've lost a lot of that. And so there's several aspects of that. Part of it is the culture pre-modernism. Architects saw themselves as artists. They saw themselves as potentially even fine artists. There's a whole issue in architecture: is, are we artists? Are we facilitators? Are we collaborators? What is it that we actually do, and what is the value that we add to it? It's interesting because we start out in the WAF Provocations with something that I'd start out with generally when I talk about this is to go all the way back to Descartes, Rene Descartes, and the very famous saying that he had, which is, "I think, therefore I am." And that sets up so many wonderful things. It sets up the fact that we're able to do this interview, over video, over the internet. It sets up, rational humanism and the concept of science and the idea of vaccines and automobiles and airplanes and all these things and legal systems, the rational side. Now, the problem is, I believe that Descartes only got half the equation there. Now, in doing some of the research with WAF and talking to some other people, it would appear that Descartes was not just a rampant rationalist, that he actually wrote about passion, but people ignored that. He wrote about the heart. He also wrote about robots before there was a word for robots, actually. It was very fascinating. And some of the research I've done on AI. And so the thing about it is, though, that I think, therefore I am, post Descartes, this is what, 1600s? So this is, 400 years ago ish. People interpreted this, as people do. What did Descartes mean? What do we want it to mean? So I think, I believe, I was going to correct myself. I believe that I think, therefore I am carried an arrogance with it, that thinking was the highest order of human achievement. So if we add to this, and I also believe very strongly these days in the concept of embracing paradox. So there's a paradox between thinking and feeling, let's say. So in the West, which is my background generally, one tries to resolve paradox by picking a box, a pink box or a blue box, a rational box or an emotional box. And in general, that can work. It depends on the balance between the two. But instead of being so rigid and saying, if you pick the box of logic and reason, you have to stay exclusively in that. And that's unhealthy. If you embrace that duality, or even more multi-leveled, and you say it's both, it's this delicious thing. I mean, the easy way is to say it's black or white. And actually, for me, if you start with the analogy of black and white, that's an easy duality or an easy binary. Instead of saying I love the grayness of the world in between, it's actually, in between black and white should be all the beautiful colors of the world, all the diversity of peoples and cultures and things in the world that make the world interesting. If we all wanted the same things, life would get really boring. The strength of the human species is the diversity of the human species. The fact that we come from different places, that we want different things. So anyway, so I wanted to add to this. So the idea of paradox is adding to things rather than taking things away, or not just creating endless boxes. So I believe that we should change the cart and add to it and go, I think, therefore I am. I care, therefore we are. So it's very important to get to we, and the I gives itself up to the we in the second part. So we had a debate on the WAF thing. The WAF thing is going to actually say we care, therefore we are. And so the variations of this, I think, are great. I mean, because they provoke conversation about, are you an I? Are you a we? And as you probably know, I mean, this is in culture in general around the world, is the idea of collaboration versus the idea of the sole heroic figure who knows everything. Now, as a paradox embracer, I think that we're in the second part of a three-part aspect of this. So the history of architecture is very much about heroic and, to try to call out the misogyny rather than to necessarily only celebrate it. It tended to be a lot of, heroic white European males. And that model of that connection. So I actually did an art piece at Burning Man on this very subject calling out the heroic model and saying that's not the only way. So we went through that. Now we got some great architecture, but it also negated most of humanity. One, all of the women, as we know, for centuries.
Yeah.
But also, anybody that just didn't fit that mold. And part of that mold is that heroic male is an aggressive and somewhat violent person.
Right.
So when we talk about, and I'm kind of jumping around a little bit here, when we talk about, gun violence in the United States, it's really a violence issue, not a gun issue. But if you really drill down and look at it, it's a male violence issue. So the FBI in the United States issued some statistics on this recently. It appears that of the homicides that involve the use of a firearm, that 93% of the perpetrators are the male of the biological gender spectrum. And then a lot of women that I talk to say, even that number is not fair, because half of those women, at least, who were part of that 7%, were defending themselves from predatory males. So now it's not a subtle statistic. It's 97% male violence. We never talk about that. We never talk about gender in the sense of, here's an obvious thing. It's not like a different spectrum, like intelligence over height. Are taller people, because they're a little bigger, a little bit more intelligent than shorter people? And I think that pretty much we understand that there is no correlation, right? And you could pick other things, eye color, all sorts of things. But there is in gender. So we like to say, and again, I'm going way off topic on the other things. So you want to pull me back, fine. Let me know. But the thing about it is one of the provocations in the towards abundance is that in terms of a balance, a healthy balance, I would submit that if you take 1 million architects, I don't know if there are 1 million architects in the world, but let's say 1 million architects, that 98% of them all design like men. And that might seem shocking at first, because women my age and older, when they were coming up through the profession, they would say, I'm an architect, I'm not a female architect. And they had to do that, because the reality, and I grew up at the end of that era, they had to do that because there were 3 tiers. There were the first-rate men, there were all the other mediocre men, and below those 2 things were all the women. If you were a female architect. But if you were an architect, you might be able to, aspire
to claim
to
the
be
upper 2.
In the upper 2. But if you said you were female, you were just relegated down to 3rd rate.
Yeah.
Okay. So the dilemma, though, is that they had to do that. I mean, that unfortunately that was the nature of the times. Now, though, that we're somewhat, and I would say, mostly free of that, not completely. There's still a lot of work to do, but that's just in labor statistics. And so in terms of what it means to be a female designer, we've sort of held that off. So one way to do this will be very snarky in a way.
Okay, I'm prepared.
Good. Prepared for the snark, because if people take it too straight up, they go, "Oh my God, what a horrible misogynist you are." You say you're twin gender, but
this is the nature of the internet, and we don't care about the internet and their opinions.
Yeah. So the snarky part is, isn't it wonderful, Marina, that you can be a female architect in today's modern profession? Aren't we special for letting you in?
Right.
Right. And people still feel that, like, they're not really letting me in. They're trying to pretend like they're doing the right thing, like pat yourself on the back.
Right.
Okay, so that's the first part. That's the snarky part. Isn't this wonderful? However, don't dare design feminine architecture. So I want to know what that is. I think that it's really important to know what that might be. And I don't want to define it, because every woman who's an architect needs to explore this. But when I say that we all design like men, it goes back to Descartes again. So I actually can pull this all the way back around. So I think, therefore I am, right? I care, therefore we are. Now, the temptation is to say, what differentiates us, and this goes into AI too, what differentiates humans from machines?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not thinking, because machines could actually think generally better than humans.
Mm.
One reason is they can balance more variables than a human can. Using language, and this is important, using language, which would also be logic, the human being can only balance, only accommodate a very small fixed set of variables. Okay, in that mindset. A computer could do as many as you want it to do. I mean, you have to give it some guidance into how to prioritize those variables, but it can do more variables than a human can. But what a computer can't do at the moment, anyway, we'll see what happens, is it can't feel. But for me, more importantly, it can't care at the moment. It doesn't have something at stake. And it's that caring part that leads to we. And the other thing about this is that you can look at another binary of there is a linear, logical, verbal thought process. And I would submit that architects in general, now this isn't the most creative architects, this isn't the Zahas and the Norman Fosters and the Frank Gehry's of the world. This is the normative architect, lives primarily in a linear, logical, verbal world. One of the things that was most interesting when I've interviewed a lot of people for jobs at Form4, and there was this young woman from the Midwest, so I was very excited to see her portfolio and work through it. And a lot of it was very straightforward, but there was this thing that was kind of wild and curvaceous. So I started asking her about it. And she started, the more I'd ask, the more she'd apologize for it. To the point where I was trying to find out, like, why this crazy form? And she didn't have a logical reason. And she said, well, I don't really want to admit, but it might have been a little arbitrary. And I said, thank you. That's the sweet spot I'm looking for, the arbitrary. One of the greatest curses or insults in architecture appears to be confessing that something's arbitrary. And I actually think that's the sweet spot. I think it's the quirky, arbitrary aspects of architecture are the things that are memorable and people actually love.
Right.
So linear, logical, verbal, that thought process is not going to permit you to do something expressive and creative and quirky and human. And so it's the multidimensional, intuitive, visual, creative process, I think, that opens that door. Now, is that gendered? Is that not gendered? I don't know. I think we should talk about it. We should try to figure it out. There's a tendency, but again, women are not monolithic. There's a tendency for women to be more empathetic. Now, maybe that's training. So when I look at the equation right now, I see men, the normative male, the warrior male, is having an old set of skills. And that old set of skills is to protect, to defend, or to be, the offender, to be, the person that goes first and attacks. And so that's an old skill set. And so women didn't have the strength. Women didn't have, the different aspects of capacity through thousands of years. They had to develop what I believe is a modern skill set, which is creating networks and communities of care.
Right.
And if you look at the most provocative question, I think one of the most provocative questions is, what's the world we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world of scarcity and fear, or do we want to live in a world of emotional abundance? So one of the ways that at least, not speaking that do women want to do this, but to me, the women I know do want to do this. So, but I'm not representative of all women, or my friends that I know are not representative. But I did a panel discussion at WAF in Lisbon with the Architectural Review prior to the publication of the gender monograph. And it was called Lovable Buildings in a Man-Made World. And we were making a little joke because on one level, there are no lovable buildings in a man-made world because male architects don't like the word lovable. And if you want to push it, so I used to do this thing where I'd say, how many people, you get a group of architects in the room, how many people would be excited if the building, if the client for the building said that the building had to be beautiful? So this is a tricky word in architecture. We're re-embracing it somewhat on a limited basis, but we're not quite sure what it means anymore. And the B word is difficult. Now, when people do that, I mean, so how many hands go up? So let's say 3/4 of the hands go up. The 1/4
That's it? What happened to the other quarter? What
okay,
the
so
heck?
the quarter, no, this is actually, 40 years ago, it would have been like 1/4 of the hands were up, and the other 3/4 would be down. And there's an easy way to illustrate this. And this is because I've talked on this a bit. So what happens is you get to the point where that 3/4, either they say, look, we're problem solvers, we look at things rationally, we look at things objectively. This subjective thing that you're introducing here is inappropriate to modern architecture. And another group says, why are you talking about superficialities like the word beauty when the world's on fire and we have climate change issues and we need to talk about carbon? And I have a response for that, as you might imagine. And that response is, the most sustainable things in life are those things you will not throw away because you love them too much. And that reintroduces the word love. And the idea is, so you got beauty. So the tricky part here is lovability is a thing that I came up with later because, words matter to people. Some words are very emotionally triggering. And I'll illustrate that with the next two. So you got 1/4 of the hands are not up, 3/4 are up. So I say, I don't think you really understand what I'm after in terms of beauty, because most of you that have your hands still up are probably thinking of Tadao Ando or Kenzo Tange, these sort of minimalist, brutalist buildings with an emphasis on minimalism, and likely non-poetic minimalism, even though one might aspire to poetic minimalism. In general, what we end up with is non-poetic minimalism, which is soul-suckingly empty. And not Zen empty, which is a good thing, but just soul-suckingly empty.
Right.
And most of what we get built, is like that. That's where Frank Gehry said, 98% of what architects produce is pure shit. So anyway, so the thing is, I go, okay, so I'm going to change the word and we're going to see what happens. So then I'd say, okay, how many people, raise your hands, would be excited if the client asked that the building be pretty? And now, only like 1/3 of the hands are up. All of the male hands are down. None of the men want to, unless they're gay males, none of the men want to have their hand up for pretty whatsoever. And the women are looking around very pensively, trying to look for validation that their hands, the women whose hands are up are part of the third. They're looking around to see if they're going to get in trouble for this. So it's problematic. So then I go to the third word. Now, again, this is very a Western thing because I'm led to believe that in other countries, this last word is actually embraced. Embraced not in architecture so much, and that's the provocation, but it is embraced. So, how many people? This way, I get all the hands go down, and not only do all the hands go down, all the people go like, John, you should leave the profession.
Leave the profession.
Leave the whole
Leave the
profession.
room.
Not just the
and
room,
the
but the
profession.
whole profession, because you're obviously delusional.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, let's hear it.
All right. I love a good build-up, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So how many people would be excited to work on this project if the client said that the project had to be cute? Am I right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have two sisters, two mothers, and two daughters. They spent 40 years trying to convince me, against my architectural training, which was very harsh, that I should embrace cute. And I resisted until I went to Burning Man in 2015. And I had a existential crisis because my friends at Burning Man, my new friends at Burning Man, who I thought were super cool because it was Burning Man, they were being very cute. And I had to decide whether I was going to embrace cute and embrace their love, or if I was going to be an architect and go, okay, I'm going to stay dressed in black like I am right now. I mean, the funny thing is, that's another little side story. So I've talked about this a lot. I finally got a picture of this at WAF in Amsterdam. So architecture, we think we're the creative profession, right? We're the imaginative ones. We're almost artists. And you would think that that would reflect in our culture. We're so conformist. I have this picture. There's like 200 architects in this big lunch area, all conversing with each other and doing things like that. And I ask people, pick out the creative one. And they can't, because we all dress within 3% of each other.
Right,
I mean,
right.
we're so conformist. So then I started wearing a fish jacket to WAF, right? Or a skull jacket or a rat jacket. So now I have these little outfits, So now I'm sort of a little bit of the eccentric. I wear the fish jacket only on like the last day with a big gala, because you don't really have time to go back and change. So, but it's interesting. The first year I did this, which I think was 2018, I had all these young architects come up and want to do a selfie with me for Instagram with the fish jacket. It was like I felt like a little rock star. And it is interesting, the people that will come up to you and say, one great quote is, "Don't leave that jacket on the chair or I'll steal it." And men don't usually talk about fashion, right? That's just like a non-thing.
Right.
Anyway, so back to Burning Man, back to the word cute. So I started to ponder the word cute. And I realized that what my two sisters, my two mothers, and my two daughters meant, I believe, was that all cute means is you love something for no reason. That doesn't mean that it's always superficial. And the word cute, when you start listening to how often people use the word cute, and now some men use the word cute too, is it means that. Now, sometimes it can be superficial, but the idea that you can only love something if you can do a 20-page essay of academic grade quality to justify why you like something is, to me, rather absurd. So, but it's a balance. It's a balance. So we need to design from the heart and not give up our mind. But right now, I would submit that we do about 95% linear, logical, verbal, and only 5% from the heart.
Do you think that, so there's like 12 questions we could ask, right? But on this last bit, do you think that shift in architecture toward a type of architecture that is more or mostly logical, maybe all logical, is
Almost
something
all.
that happened since?
Oh, I have a date for you. I do.
Okay, perfect.
I have a date, and I have two milestones for that date. So this is like the fun thing with talking on this is, people ask this exact question a lot, like, when did this happen? So in my view, now there are recent things going on right now because the computer and parametric design and fluidity now have reignited, I think, a design from the heart scenario. And so culture goes in cycles. But I think in 1966, two things happened. The broad cultural thing that happened is that the Temptations, which was an African-American group,
band,
musical group, they made a song famous called "Beauty Is Only Skin Deep." And I grew up in that era of 1966, so I was a little on the young side, but this defined an era back then. It also led to unisex clothing, which is really boring, by the way, in general. But it doesn't have to be boring, but it was at the time. So, but the idea that beauty is only skin deep opened up worlds to people in the sense that, you know, there was inner beauty, that it was challenging stereotypes of beauty, the Barbie doll being one of them, you know, which is just a great good and bad icon of the feminine masculine binary. And it challenged those things, and it opened things up. It was an incredibly wonderful thing. At the same time, in 1966, Robert Venturi published Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. Now, the first sentence, if you go back and you read it, the first sentence sounds very promising in terms of postmodernism wanting to start to address the sterility of international style modernism, right? Which was the basis of minimalism, you know. So it's like reductive process. And my when I look at reductive process, I go, okay, well, that's fine, you know, get to the essence of architecture. But there's a certain point where what you're taking out every time you go through a layer of reduction is you're taking the humanity out.
Yeah.
And at the end, you get this machine that in the end, it's an acquired taste. It's either poetic or it's really boring again. The problem is, and I always get in trouble for saying this, but you know, that's the point of being a provocateur, is unfortunately not many architects are talented enough to design poetic minimalism. It's really hard.
Yeah, this is
really
a fact.
Hard.
Yeah.
And so you have to question. So somebody once said when I was giving a talk and said, yeah, you know, modernism never developed a healthy vernacular. And I tried to figure out what that meant. And to me, what that meant is the Tuscan style, for example, you know, from Italy. 100 years ago, most architects could design a beautiful, very lovable building in a Tuscan style. They understood what that style was. They understood how to make it into something that touched the human soul. Part of that was because there were things to help them do that. There were stylistic aspects that were identifiable, and not just rationally, not just the equation for the 5 orders of columns, you know, that's very mathematical. Those things started not with math. They started with a perception. They started from the heart, right? It's too heavy. It's too thin. You know, it's too this, it's too that. And then it got reduced back to mathematics. I tell people, do you know what the golden section is? And if they remember the actual ratio and they adhere to it religiously, I tell them they haven't developed as a designer, because you need to know that in your heart, not the math itself. You need to know it in your heart. Does it feel right? Not does it, you know, fit the program perfectly? Does it fit the math equation? Bernard Maybeck used to get in trouble all the time for making his columns too thin or too thick. But of all the buildings in the Pan Pacific exhibition in 1915, his building was the one that was saved, which is the Palace of the Fine Arts. And all of the critics said that, you know, he was insane because he messed with the proportions. But it had heart, and that's why it's still there. And anyway, so now I can't remember where we're going.
I me neither. But I want to ask you. So you at one point you were talking about complexity and contradiction in architecture.
Oh yeah, complexity and contradiction in architecture. Okay, so the first sentence, you know, says something like, you know, I embrace or I advocate for complexity and contradiction in architecture, you know, and kind of make things kind of messy, and I get all excited. Yep. Then I read the second one, which says fundamentally, doesn't say this directly, but it says this fundamentally: do not design from the heart.
I have to go back and read the first 2 sentences now.
If you go through the whole thing, he never uses the word beauty once. Never.
Interesting.
Never.
Interesting.
Okay, so we know his work. He's a brilliant architect. He was really good at what he did. But what he did was sort of like a highly intellectualized, you know, versus Michael Graves, for example. So they both used irony. They both used sort of like changing the scale. It was mannerist, which could be also called cartoonist. in Michael Graves' case, it was cartoonist style architecture. In Venturi's case, it was mannerist, which is the same thing, just a more polite term. His was more intellectually rigorous, but we followed the intellectually rigorous side of it. And Michael Graves got sort of, he was very famous for a while, and then it was like, no, he's just kind of quirky.
Right.
And
right.
so we followed the logic. We didn't follow the heart. And so what happened, though, was these two things, the profession of architecture and the fine arts institutions, right? Because I had my background in the fine arts. I was also the co-chair of the San Francisco Art Institute for 3 years.
Okay.
Co-chair of the board. So I have a background in the fine arts and in fine art board work, and in a sense running an art school. But the fine arts institutions and the profession of architecture reinterpreted all of this to mean that anything that was beautiful was de facto superficial. And so that curse of superficiality, architects literally, I've seen them do this, they would design out the beauty in their buildings in order to make them serious,
Right.
in order to make them acceptable to this newfound iron fist of logic.
Right.
And I think that, what happened there was that if you take the humanity out of architecture through a reductivist approach, you shouldn't be surprised when humanity can't see itself and stop loving what you do.
Yeah.
And so so remember the lovability thing?
Yep.
Okay, so lovable buildings in a man-made world. So interesting provocation there was, so I'm in a meeting with the Architectural Review, with Manon and with members of the Architectural Review editorial staff, and we're talking about this panel discussion, and we're talking about lovability. So I said, I think what would be good is if the panelists, so I and a person named Max Zarnicki, we were the co-chairs of the panel, and we were also on the panel. And so we were going to ask all the panelists who in the end were all either cis women or non-binary folks, right? So Max and I and this other person were non-binary, and then there were 3 biological women. So we had a certain perspective, but we asked them, everyone, to bring 2 examples of lovable architecture. So the AR, being the AR, they thoughtfully said, a challenge. So John, you need to define, if you're going to ask them to do this, you need to define what that is. Lovable architecture. And so we had this really fascinating debate, and they were trying to show examples, and I said, no, that's not lovable. I said, we all in the room might love this. It's not lovable, though. And there's a difference. So Tadao Ando's, Church of the Light is a poetic, powerful building and a space, and it is not lovable, though. We can love it, but that's different than lovable. So lovable is more of a let's call it common culture thing, and it's more of a reaction, right? But it's not that you. So it makes you feel a certain way. But so still, they were doubling down then on saying, well, now you need to really define this. So I went away, so we had a meeting every week, and I went away, and I came back the next day, and the next week, and they said, oh, so do you have your definition of lovable? We didn't miss that in the email. And I said, well, yeah, they are a great group. I love them.
Yeah, sly.
Yeah. But I said, I have a definition, but I'm not going to share it. And I said, there's a reason. I believe that lovability is an intention. It's not a style. And so I want 1 million different designers with the intention of lovability, creating something. I don't want to tell them what it is. I think that would be counterproductive to the whole thing. Because now I'm back in the linear, logical, verbal world, right? Yeah. I'm going to use language to tell them what it is. Or I'm going to pick a style. I'm going to say, oh, Frank Lloyd Wright style is lovable.
Yeah.
Which I believe it is, right?
Sure.
I mean, Mies van der Rohe, sometimes lovable, sometimes not. Even like the Seagram's Tower, it's powerful. I wouldn't call it
Right.
lovable. The
So,
Barcelona Pavilion, maybe. I love it. I passionately love it. It's like one of the most poetic works of modern architecture, the Barcelona. I've only
yeah.
seen the reproduction in Barcelona, but
Right. Right.
it's moving.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's lovable. And we have to differentiate. That's the thing, is the world is complex. So there's poetic, and that's really valuable. Let's not give that up. And there's lovable, which we've sort of lost, and I think we need to come back. And then there's everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the everything in between. I want to make that better, right? So if you can't get to poetic, let's try lovable. And if you need a little help with lovable, and you need a little, stylistic or whatever help, that's not a bad thing. And so, but I am excited about, all of these incredible things that are coming, out of more curvaceous architecture, that started with Zaha and Frank Gehry. And I think, it's just a personal opinion that with Zaha's office, in the absence of Zaha, there's sort of two tracks there. There's the heavily parametric, which
Sure.
I think is going back into the linear, logical, verbal. It's prescriptive. It's interesting, but I don't think it's going to last. And then there's the quirky stuff, which is what Zaha really, really was good at.
So I have a number of questions with this. Is one of the challenges with creating or teaching and learning about lovable architecture, poetic architecture, beautiful architecture, that in the space of discourse, architectural discourse and academia, it's hard to teach that, to talk about that, because it seems to be something that is not.
Yeah.
I sort of, to your point earlier, it's hard to, maybe it's not impossible, it's certainly really difficult to have an hour lecture about rationalizing why something is one way.
This is all doable. We used to teach this. We did. 60 years ago, we used to teach this. We just decided that it was superficial. Right? We used to have moments where it was about the craft and the art of architecture, about the emotional, what you felt, and how you could create form that had feeling. So what would happen when I've gone to jury crits at UC Berkeley or at CCA or at the Academy of Art University in San Francisco, right? The three architecture schools. Everybody on the juries, they all want to talk about concept. And I'd be the only one that would say, well, this idea is great, but the form doesn't do it.
Right.
And they don't want to talk about the form.
Yeah.
And I go, it's ill proportioned, it's this.
Yeah.
And then they go, oh, that's subjective. And I go, this is the most important thing that this poor student can learn, is that they need to up their game on creating. So beauty is an interesting word. Like, that's an easy word, cute, lovable. The overarching thing, which I'm hoping is a bridging concept, is emotional meaning. So emotional meaning rather than beauty. I mean, we said the absurdity of beauty because the absurdity of emotional meaning wouldn't work. And the absurdity of beauty, well, the issue of absurdity with beauty is engineers will tell you beauty is absurd because it can't be proven to exist.
It's a sad way to look at the
I know. Well,
with
the
it.
reality with that, if you're going to call them out on that, is you haven't proven it to exist. It's always existed. You just haven't caught up yet, right? And so that's on you, not on me. Like,
right.
Like, because you can't, shine a light on it exactly doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So
Sure.
So anyway, we live in an evolving world. And so, but I think that emotional meaning, so the first step with emotional meaning is to look at any building and say, what are the emotional meanings that come from this building? And so there's a rational side of that where you could do a survey. Now, here's where it gets tricky too. Google, for example, can tell you quantitatively what's popular,
Yeah.
but they can't tell you what's good qualitatively. Now, that's a trickier thing because, popularity doesn't, as we all know, as designers and artists, popularity does not equal quality. And so it's that issue of, what do you want to do with your life? What's the balance between quality and popularity? And so in this case, where I'm arguing for a little of both is that we've gone so far off into this kind of esoteric linear line. And the architecture is not the only place. The legal profession's done the same thing. The medical profession is notorious now for not caring, in spite of the advertisements that the hospitals try to convince you that we care. It's like, go try to get care. And then they go, oh, no, we don't cover that. Oh, no. Or suck it up and just go through the pain. And I'm not saying the medical profession is in crisis. It's just that, there's been shifts in all professions, in all aspects of life about, the emotional part, the empathy part, the caring part.
Do you see that there is a shift, I say back in a sense toward thinking about these things? Because sometimes I see it. It depends on also context and one's experiences, who they know and what they've seen. But sometimes I see that, and other times I see that architecture is many cases doubling, tripling down on the hyper logic rabbit hole.
Oh yeah,
that
absolutely.
In itself becomes so convoluted that it's
so
from the outside.
I've seen it on both sides. So I've seen it as I became friends through Towards Abundance because I'm going to say this wrong probably. Dang Trin, who's a partner at Mad Architects. She and Mao and Fiona, who is part of their team, we all got together in Venice, and Trin wrote a beautiful article, essay that was in Towards Abundance on time and gender. It was fascinating. Time, chaos, and gender. It was one of my favorite things that were written in the thing. So we had 6 designers that wrote perspectives. And I think their work, for example, is like carrying the original legacy of Zaha's work and Frank Gehry's work. It's expressive, it's imaginative, it's emotionally engaging. I mean, it's curvaceous. So if you do that right, it's inherently beautiful. I mean, it's inherently, there's a lovability to that. Because I would say that Frank Gehry's work and Zaha's work is highly lovable in general. Not every single one, because as the more creative you are, you're going to have ups and downs too. Some of the work is like, ugh.
Sure.
But anyway, the thing is all of them, they're doing these great things. I still go to meetings, and this is partially a local thing, but I've heard this on a national level and the international level. Is people will say, oh yeah, well we want design awards to not be based on superficial things like beauty. We want it to be based on how you dealt with carbon and how you dealt with this and how you dealt with that. And I said, well, to me, a design award is the art of putting form to ideas. So if it's an ideas award, that's one thing. If it's a design award, it's how well did the form satisfy all of these things, the quality of the form. That's considered to be superficial. Yeah, overwhelmingly superficial. And so it's a point where I try to correct people all the time, and then they really look at me like, you need to leave the room, John. You're going to use the word cute again, aren't you? When I got in trouble once for sitting, having a discussion with an editor of a major architectural magazine, and we were going along swimmingly until I used the word cute, and then that was over.
It's an odd thing. I don't understand why there is this temptation or this need or this pattern fairly often for within the profession of architecture, on the professional side and the academic side, to want to like squeeze out qualities of architecture and say we don't really care about this, we don't want to talk about it, when we all kind of fundamentally know that what architecture is, regardless of how we define it, is everything all wrapped up into one building or one thing.
Yeah.
And so it's a very odd...
And we judge things and people based on if they're beautiful or not. So,
on all aspects of it, especially beauty.
Yeah.
And it is, I suppose, a paradox in a sense.
Well, so that's the thing is, like you look at something, any object, and it goes back to, the things you won't throw away because you love them too much.
Yeah.
So you have this reaction, this visceral reaction to something. I love that. I don't know why. The definition of cute, right? I don't know why, but I love it. That's important. So if we negate that, and that's what, because it's subjective, we've been doing that too much. And I think that it negates so much richness in the world. So one of the more recent things I've done is, so this is for the WAF thing, is there's the individual, right? So this goes back to collaboration. Then there's groups. So think of a triptych. So you've got an individual image on one side, and then in the middle, there's a bunch of spheres, and in each side of the sphere is a different group. There's babies, there's elderly Asian women, there's young black men, there's all these different groups, right? And we can belong to different groups, tall people, short people. And they have an overwhelming power sometimes over us. But at the same time, we're all human. And we tend to forget that all human part. And but the richness of all being human is that, again, that we're all different, and that self-expression in balance with community is really important. So that you're all of these things. You're an individual, you're a member of different groups, and the alignment of those different groups is also part of your individual preference. So my view is at least in terms of gender, is you yourself are the only person who can determine what you feel your gender is, not your biology, but your sexuality and your gender are independent things. Of course, that's a modern notion. In the old days, it was like you were born into the pink box or the blue box, and you can't leave.
Yeah.
And we're going to make the box really rigid so that you don't make any mistakes.
Right.
Like a kilt's okay, but only if you're actually Scottish or on Halloween.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like, why? The Romans wore skirts. The Greeks wore skirts.
I wonder. It's true. I wonder if some of the reason why architecture and architects have, in the last X number of decades, wanted to, again, push out notions of beauty and focus on being very rational and things like this, is that itself is a kind of, it's a, like you were talking about earlier, that it's sort of, in a sense, human nature to want comfort and to very clearly define this versus that, and to create boxes for oneself or one's profession. And I think there's some of that. I think it is human nature. I think there's some of that has bled into architecture too, because it is easier to do it that way. Yeah, it's really what you're talking about is not comfortable for most people, and it's not easy for most people. And I even if architects tend to be more open-minded than most, and we like problem solving, and we claim that we're this and that, we're these ways
into problem solving. It's interesting. So when I got out of school, I had my minor was environmental psychology, and part of that was there was a firm in Texas called CRS. And there was a delightful partner there named William Pena, and he did a book which was at the time very famous called Problem Solving. And at the time when I was in school, it was actually the opposite way around. It was too subjective, and there wasn't enough focus on problem solving. Now it's swung all the way over to the other side, where we're problem solvers and facilitators, but we don't do any magic anymore. We don't inspire people, we don't touch their hearts. And culture goes in swings. And so, but my theory is, as culture goes in swings, when it's at the bottom and not working very well, and hence the issue of cultural relevancy for architecture, we're becoming like the fine arts, less and less relevant to the average person, because nobody can understand this building unless they've been schooled in the minimalist art of Tadao Ando, and they can't understand anything else. And so there's a little phrase I also have is, have we exhausted the conceit yet that the public simply needs to catch up? And so I love minimalism, poetic minimalism. It's just that the stuff that's not poetic is damaging.
And it's the majority, as you said earlier.
The overwhelming majority. Frank Gehry is right.
Yeah. And, you were also talking about, one of the questions I posed a few minutes ago was, if notions of beauty there's enough discourse around it for it to be taught and et cetera. And you said yes, because that's what we used to do.
The thing about it is you can't teach it in the normal way. You have to go back to how people used to teach it before. You have to go back to just having people sketch.
Well,
this is interesting, the thing of sketching. Now, I was one of I started designing directly on the computer in a program called Form4 in 1991.
Form4.
In 1991, I had this little Mac CI. It had 8 megabytes of RAM, and 80 megabyte hard drive. And I was designing buildings in 3D with that limited hardware. And so I'm an early proponent of digital design. And I taught a class at UC Berkeley for 5 years, and I wouldn't allow my students to sketch at all because they needed to learn a different mindset of how to design on the computer without sketching. However, sketching is really important. And also nonverbal means of education. Mm-hmm. So linear, logical, verbal, the language is a barrier to many things. And so we don't want to get rid of language. I love language. I'm a poet. But poetry, for example, is taking language to get you out of language, taking language to transport you to a visual place or an emotional state that's different than prose. So we need both of these things. It's just that people don't read poetry anymore, which is sad, right? They read a lot of prose. They read a lot of, essays. There are ways to do this. There are ways but they're sort of like a little older.
Isn't it hard to do that though? Because it also requires for some reason I keep thinking about school. It requires the teachers.
Oh yeah, they have to understand.
To know
they don't
it,
understand
and that's the issue, right?
Yeah.
But I think it comes down to in school. The problem is that most teachers are architects only, and really you should have
architects or are not architects.
Well, are and aren't, but I think we should just bring in more artists, more other types of creatives that could
That's
teach
right. Yeah. So
about
what happens is
beauty and emotions and all of those things, right?
You have to find people that believe in that, and so you got to like baby steps. Now, having said all this, what's interesting is I did 10 articles with the Arch Daily on the topic of the metaverse and AI. and the very last one was how AI will make us all better designers for better or worse. And we only have 11 minutes left, but the thing is, in that context, and again, I mean, we could go on, we could do another one of these, but we could start talking about AI. But here's the thing. So I wrote about this in like 6 of the essays. I wrote from experience. Part of that experience was leading a team of designers in a design competition for a building that was 400 meters tall, that was a portal to the metaverse. And so we had a design team that I led of 50 people, some of which who were not architects, most of which were not architects, and some of them were experienced designers, and some of them were metaverse designers, and some of them were AI experts. And we did this, in a sense, giant research project that was also known as a design competition. And so I started writing about the metaverse, but then we started talking about AI. So I thought I'll just learn Midjourney to illustrate one of the articles. So with 8 words, I was able to come up with something that was very compelling that you could see in the article. And so compelling that people have copied it now and used it in other articles on Arch Daily, which is when you do an Arch Daily article, any other writer for Arch Daily can steal your stuff, which is fine. But the reality is, when I looked at it, I realized that, 80% of the architects, maybe 90% of the architects I know, can't design something as compelling as what AI gave me. I didn't design it, I curated it, right? I gave it words. I did not design it. I did not move things around. It gave me something that was really impressive. It also gave me a lot of bad stuff too. But it didn't take that long. It took way shorter than if I had 20 architects in a room. It might take 6 months for one of them, if I'm lucky, to come up with something as good as AI did in about an hour. That's scary. That part's scary. That work is, now this was a parametric curve-based thing, but what it is doing is it's inventing this thing on the basis of the AI stuff, or not the AI stuff, the images it finds on the web that respond to the word parametric curve.
Right.
And that stuff at the moment is actually pretty interesting and pretty good. So it depends on the quality of the stuff you feed it. So if you feed it, all of the best minimalist work, you're going to get really good minimalist work. It's going to be somewhat derivative, but it's going to be, it's my experience is it's actually better than what most architects can design. So that's another provocation. Are we all going to go the way I'm advocating for, design from the heart, or are we going to give it all up and let AI do it? And my fear is we're going to give it all up and let AI do it, because we've abandoned the heart already. The thing is, there's another article before that one that talks about how AI is really going to it's already here. AI is not going to steal your job as a designer. You've already given it up. And you've already given it up by not creating emotionally resonant designs for people. And AI has no problem doing that. AI loves to pander to the population, which architects refuse to do. So AI wants to make things lovable, because AI says, if you say lovable, it'll go there. It will. It won't go like lovable. We don't do lovable in architecture. It won't do that. It doesn't have that attitude.
Yeah. Not yet, at least. Maybe
you can
AI
program
architect.
it to have any attitude. Like if you take a group of 100 of those architects and you create AI agents, right?
Right.
And you study their life and their work, and you create those agents. They'll have that same attitude.
Yeah, there'll be 99 dressed in black and one with a fish jacket.
Exactly.
In the petri dish.
Right.
We blew through this hour and a half. There's
so much more.
We could keep talking for sure, and I have a lot of questions too. So let's call this a conversation to be continued.
Yeah.
We do have a final question we always like to ask.
Yeah.
Especially for the architects, is what is your favorite building?
Oh, there's so many. That's
sometimes the hardest question.
Well, because I believe architecture's a feast, and over the styles. So but I could name architects, but it's a wide variety. It goes from Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion, which I mentioned before, and to Dao Ando's, Church of the Light, to Gaudi and his crazy, dragon buildings, and to all sorts of Art Nouveau, and to Mario Botta, and there's just this great feast, but it's such a small little subset, of what actually gets built. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, I think it's an appropriate answer for the conversation, definitely. John, thank you so much for making the time on a Friday morning to speak with us. It blew by, which is a great sign, and I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope to stay in touch.
Yeah, I look forward to, if you want to do, another one. I'm perfectly happy to talk for another hour and a half.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail. If you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion, feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.